The dog didn't bark. That was the first thing Nora Keene noticed. Every other animal in the waiting room had reacted to the man the moment he walked through the door. The tabby cat in the carrier by the window pressed itself flat against the back wall. The beagle on the bench started whining. Even the old retriever that had been half asleep lifted its head and tucked its ears back. But the German shepherd walking beside Master Corporal Damon Streich didn't make a sound. It just moved. Precise, deliberate, scanning the room like it was clearing a building, not coming in for a checkup. Streich himself wasn't much different. He was still in his combats, not because he'd come straight from base, Nora would later find out, but because he simply hadn't bothered to change. The jacket was undone at the collar. His jaw was set in the particular way of someone who had decided before walking into any room that nothing inside it was going to be a problem. The dog's name was Ghost. It was written on the intake form that Streich dropped on the front desk without being asked, without making eye contact with the receptionist, without slowing down. "Back corner," he said, not to anyone specific, just to the room. Nora was coming out of exam room 3 with a clipboard when she heard it. She glanced over, saw the dog, saw the man, saw the way he'd positioned himself so that his back was to the wall, and Ghost was beside his left leg, and there was a clear line of sight to both the entrance and the hallway. She went back to her clipboard. She had been a registered veterinary technician at Clearwater Animal Hospital in Sudbury for 6 years. In that time, she had handled a retired police dog with a torn cruciate, 2 military contract horses after a training accident in Petawawa, and once a wolf hybrid that someone in Espanola had been keeping illegally in a double wide. She knew what animals looked like when they had been trained to work. She also knew what they looked like when they were in pain and had learned to hide it. Ghost was hiding something. She could see it in the way the dog carried its left shoulder. Not limping, not dragging, but subtly rolling inward on each step, redistributing weight with the practiced efficiency of an animal that had been conditioned never to show weakness. She walked to the front desk and picked up the intake form. Ghost, male, intact, 7 years. Belgian Malinois Sermon Shepherd Cross. Retired Canadian Armed Forces service dog. Last vet contact, 14 months ago. Reason for visit. Routine. Routine. She almost smiled at that. "I'll take him in room 2, she said to Deb at the front desk. Deb gave her a look. "Dr. Whitmore's already. Room 2's free. I'll start the intake." She walked down the hall and set up the exam table and laid out the equipment she already knew she was going to need, because the shoulder wasn't the only thing. The way Ghost had scanned the room, the slight tension around the eyes, the controlled but elevated respiration. She had seen it before, not in a dog. In a man who had come into the Sudbury General Emergency Triage where her mother worked 18 years ago when Nora was 12 years old and had been brought along because there was no one to watch her. A veteran of the First Gulf War with a traumatic brain injury who had sat in the waiting room for 4 hours because no one had known how to approach him without making him worse. Her mother had been the one who finally figured it out. She'd sat down on the floor beside his chair, below his eye line, and just talked quietly about nothing in particular, and after about 10 minutes, the man had started to cry. Nora had never forgotten that. She went back to the waiting room. "Ghost?" she called, the way she always did, addressing the animal, not the owner. Streich looked up from where he'd been staring at the floor. He assessed her in the flat, quick way she was beginning to recognize as simply how he looked at things. Not hostile, not warm, just calibrating. "He doesn't do well with strangers," Streich said. "Most of my patients don't." She kept her voice even. "Exam room 2 is ready. Take your time." She turned and walked back down the hall without waiting for him, which she had learned, years ago, was often the most important thing you could do, remove the pressure of being watched. She heard the dog's nails on the tile a few seconds later. In the exam room, she didn't move toward Ghost. She set the clipboard on the counter and made a few notes with her back partly turned, giving him time to smell the room, the table, the equipment. She could hear Streich come in behind her and position himself near the door. She didn't acknowledge it. "Left shoulder," she said, still writing. "How long?" A pause. "What?" "He's been favoring his left shoulder. How long?" Another pause, longer this time. She turned around. Streich was watching her with an expression she couldn't immediately read, somewhere between irritation and something else. 3 weeks, maybe. Did something happen, or did it come on gradually? Gradually. Any changes in appetite? Sleep? He's not sleeping great. Neither are you, she said, and then immediately regretted it. Not because it wasn't true. She could see it plainly in the bruising under his eyes and the particular rigidity of someone who had been running on adrenaline and stubbornness for longer than was sustainable, but because it wasn't her place and she knew it, and she braced for the reaction. Streich looked at her for a long moment. He's the patient, he said. He is, she agreed. Can I approach him? He'll let you know if you shouldn't. That was, she thought, both a permission and a warning, and she accepted both. She crouched down to Ghost's level, not on the floor, not quite, but low enough that she wasn't looming, and she looked at a point just past his left ear, and she waited. Ghost looked at her. She didn't move. The dog took one step forward. Then another. He put his nose about 6 inches from her face, and she felt the warmth of his breath, and she stayed very still and kept her eyes soft and let him take his time. Then Ghost put his head on her shoulder. Not nudging, not investigating. He just rested it there. The full, deliberate weight of his head, pressing gently against the side of her neck, and she felt the slow exhale move through his whole body. She brought one hand up carefully and rested it on his flank. She said nothing. She heard Streich make a sound. She didn't look up. That's... He stopped. It's okay, she said quietly, to the dog, to the man, to both of them maybe. She worked slowly after that. She ran her hands along Ghost's spine, checked the shoulder joint with the careful, methodical pressure of someone who had done this hundreds of times, watched the dog's face for any sign of flinching. There was a slight tightening around the muzzle when she found the tensor spot near the supraspinatus, but Ghost didn't pull away. He pressed slightly harder against her instead. There's some soft tissue damage here, she said. Old injury probably. That wasn't given enough rest. He's been compensating for a while. It's not critical yet, but if it goes another few months, it will be. She looked up at Streich. When did he retire from active deployment? 8 months ago. Was he assessed before discharge? Something shifted in Streich's expression. He was supposed to be. She waited. There was a backlog, Streich said, and the word came out with the particular flatness of someone delivering a fact they are furious about and have made peace with and are still furious about. They were decommissioning a lot of dogs at the same time. There was a whole process that was supposed to happen. Full veterinary clearance, behavioral assessment, transition protocol. Ghost was supposed to spend 8 weeks in a dedicated rehabilitation program before I was even cleared to take him home, but the program got defunded 6 weeks before his discharge date. He said it the same way. Flat. Final practiced. They did a 2-hour assessment instead, declared him fit for adoption, gave me a pamphlet. Nora looked at the dog. Ghost was still leaning against her, one ear tilted back toward Streich, one forward toward her, monitoring both of them with the same calm efficiency. How long had you two been partnered? She asked. 4.5 years. She nodded slowly. She set her hand flat against Ghost's shoulder, the injured one, and felt him lean into it instead of away. Has he seen anyone? She asked. For the behavioral side, there's a waiting list. How long? 7 months when I put his name on it. That was 4 months ago. She stood up. She went to the counter and began writing up her notes, and she took a breath, and she said what she had been thinking since she'd picked up the intake form. I want to be clear about something, she said. And I'm saying this as a professional, not because I'm overstepping. The physical injury is real, and we can treat it. Laser therapy, a structured rest protocol, some targeted exercises. I'll put together a full plan. But what I'm seeing in Ghost is not just physical. She turned to look at Streich directly. He's been in a high-stress operational environment for the better part of 5 years. He retired into what was supposed to be a supported transition and instead got a pamphlet and a waiting list. His body is telling you what the system didn't bother to. He's exhausted. He's been holding himself together because that's what he was trained to do and because you need him to. And he will keep doing that until he can't. The room was very quiet. Streich was looking at the dog, not at her, at Ghost, who was still standing calmly by the exam table with his weight slightly listed toward the spot where Nora had been. I know, Streich said. It was the first thing he had said that didn't sound practiced. I know, he said again, quieter. I didn't want to admit how bad it had gotten, because then I'd have to admit I'd been letting it get that way. Nora put her pen down. She had a policy, professional and personal, about not inserting herself into the emotional lives of her clients. She kept appropriate distance. She gave information, she gave care, she followed up. She did not sit on the floor of exam rooms and talk about things that weren't strictly veterinary. She had learned that boundary early, and she maintained it carefully. She pulled the rolling stool out from under the counter and sat down on it, which put her roughly at Ghost's eye level. My mum worked emergency triage at Sudbury General for 28 years, she said. She used to say that the hardest patients to treat weren't the ones who came in at their worst. They were the ones who came in just before their worst, because they'd been managing it themselves for so long that they'd stopped being able to tell the difference between coping and just not collapsing yet. Streich looked at her. I'm talking about Ghost, she said, without quite smiling. Obviously. Something moved across his face that might have been the beginning of a smile and stopped just short of becoming one. Obviously. Ghost patted over to Streich and sat down beside him and leaned against his leg, and Streich put his hand on the dog's head without looking down, the automatic gesture of someone who had been doing it for years. There's a woman named Dr. Brigitte Moreau, Nora said, going back to her notes. She runs an animal-assisted trauma recovery program out of North Bay. She started it specifically for retired military and police service dogs. She lost her own dog, a retired RCMP shepherd, to what she calls secondary trauma syndrome, and she built the program after that. There's no wait list because the provincial funding she gets requires her to prioritize active cases. I can refer Ghost directly. She looked up. I've sent 3 dogs to her program in the past 2 years. All 3 are doing well. One is back to full mobility and has a new role as a facility dog at a hospice in Timmins. Streich was quiet for a moment. Why are you telling me this? Because Ghost needs it and the system failed to provide it, and I know someone who can actually help. Why do you know that? You just met him. She considered the question seriously, because it deserved a serious answer. Because he put his head on my shoulder, she said, and he's been in this exam room for 20 minutes and he hasn't looked at the door once. That's not nothing. That's a dog who has been carrying something alone for a long time and is ready, really ready, to put it down. He just needed someone to make it feel safe enough. She paused. That's the easy part, honestly. The hard part is getting the people who love them to believe it's okay to ask for help. Streich didn't say anything. Ghost yawned, a long, jaw-cracking, full-body yawn, and put his chin on Streich's knee. The tension in the room, which had been there since the moment Streich had dropped the intake form on the front desk and told the waiting room to stay out of his way, came apart quietly, the way ice does in spring, not all at once but in pieces steadily. Dr. Moreau's program, Streich said finally, it's residential? 3 weeks, with regular follow-up sessions after. You'd be able to visit. She actually encourages it. She says the recovery works better when the handler is involved, not just dropping the dog off and waiting. I'd be included. You'd be expected to show up. She met his eyes. Both of you have been carrying this. It makes more sense to address it together. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Ghost. Then he looked at the intake form on the counter. Routine, it said, in his own handwriting, and something in his face shifted quietly and completely, the way a person's face shifts when they finally say a true thing after a long time of not saying it. Okay, he said. Okay, do the referral. She wrote up the full treatment plan. Laser therapy twice a week for the first month, a specific exercise protocol she drafted herself, dietary adjustments to support joint recovery, and the referral to Dr. Moreau's program with a detailed case summary she spent extra time on because she wanted it to be thorough enough that Moreau would understand exactly what she was dealing with. She also, at the bottom of the referral notes, wrote, Handler should be included in intake assessment. Handler presenting signs consistent with secondary trauma and chronic sleep deprivation. Recommend program staff initiate informal wellness check during first visit. She didn't tell Streich she'd written that part. When she walked them back to the front desk, Ghost stayed close to her side, not because she'd given him any instruction. She hadn't. He just drifted that way, easily, naturally, the way water finds the lowest ground. Streich noticed. He didn't comment on it directly. Same tech next visit? He asked at the desk, which was not how most clients phrase that question. If I'm in, Nora said, but I'll make sure whoever takes you has the full file. He nodded. He clipped Ghost's lead on. He turned toward the door. Keene, he said, without looking back. She looked up. Thank you, he said. Just that. No qualifications, no armor around it. Just the words, said like they meant something. Ghost looked back at her once from the door, ears forward, tail making 2 slow sweeps. Then they were gone. Deb appeared at her elbow approximately 4 seconds later. "What just happened?" she said. "He told the entire waiting room not to look at his dog when he came in." "He was scared," Nora said simply, gathering her file. "He just didn't know how to say it. And the dog? Same." She tucked the clipboard under her arm. "They're going to be okay. I think they've both been waiting for someone to tell them it was allowed." She went back down the hall. Room 3 had a rabbit in it with a suspected molar spur, and after that she had a senior cat's blood work to review, and after that she had the laser therapy scheduling to figure out for Ghost's first session. And the day moved on the way days do, steadily and without ceremony. But she thought about it later, driving home on the long highway north of the city with the early September dark coming in fast and the spruce trees black against the last of the light, the radio murmuring something she wasn't really listening to. She thought about a boy, a man, now, and his dog, and the particular kind of courage it took to walk into a room when you didn't trust the room, and the particular kind of exhaustion that came from doing that for too long. She thought about her mother on the floor of that emergency waiting room 18 years ago, sitting below the eye line of a man who needed to feel safe before he could feel of anything else. She thought about Ghost's head on her shoulder, and the weight of it, and the trust in it, and how some things couldn't be faked and couldn't be forced, and only happened when they were ready. 3 weeks later, she got a message through the clinic's referral system from Dr. Brigitte Moreau's office. It was brief and professional and said that Ghost had completed his initial intake assessment and had settled well into the program, and that the handler had agreed, on his own initiative, to participate in the parallel support sessions offered to handlers during the residential period. She read it twice. Then she went and started the kettle because room 4 had a husky in it that had eaten approximately a third of a wool blanket, and she was going to need the tea. She was almost at the door when the message system pinged again. A second note from Moreau's office, this one with a short addendum that wasn't standard clinical language. "Handler asked me to pass along. He said to tell you Ghost slept through the night for the first time in 8 months. Thought you'd want to know." Nora stood in the hallway for a moment. Outside the window at the end of the corridor, the Sudbury sky was doing that thing it did in late September, going every color at once, before the cold came in for good. Golden rust and that particular deep blue that only existed for about 20 minutes in the northern fall and then was gone until next year. She looked at it for those 20 minutes. Then she went in to see the husky.